Amazing. Welcome, everyone. So fun to see people dancing. I have been so excited for this class all day. I couldn't sleep last night. I'm feeling the energy building of it. So thank you all so much for being here and for taking time out of your evening to be with us. For those of you who might not be familiar with me, my name is Claire Wariasid, and I am a student midwife, a spiritual counselor, and a multidisciplinary artist. And I want to share with you the opening song that I just chose that we were all dancing to, which is a beautiful medicine song that I love called Canta Pajarillo, which means sing little bird. And I want to just translate some of the lyrics for you guys, which are Somos hombres y mujeres de esperanza en los tiempos de violencia y en los tiempos de conciencia, which translates to We are the men and women of hope in times of violence and in times of consciousness. And so when I think about the current state of men and women in our modern world, I really just do feel that we are navigating times of profound violence and also profound consciousness. So, seriously, thank you again to each and every single one of you for joining live, for listening to the recording. There were almost 100 people who registered for this class, which is like the most that has registered for any class that I've held thus far. There's like a big watch party going on in Denver with Alani, which I'm going to pass it over to her kind of towards the end. And there's been tons of people like all around the world in various time zones who have emailed me and asked if there would be a recording. Answer is yes, which is just incredible, right? And what I would say about all of that is that the fact that so many of you are interested in a conversation like this reminds me that there are men and women of hope in the world, including all of you. So, to offer us a little bit of orientation to the work that we're going to be doing together, I'm going to guide us through a short grounding in practice to just honor the male and female lineages that we're coming from. So, I invite you all to either close your eyes or just pull your attention away from the screen. Get comfortable in a seated or laying down position, whatever feels good in your body. We're only going to be here for a couple minutes. And just taking a few moments to feel your flesh beneath you, your bones stacking. Feeling your breath, making sure we're all on mute. And tapping into the truth of who you are, which is a child of this earth, a child of the stars. Tapping into the lineages that you come from. Starting first with over your right shoulder, your father line, the men that you come from. Hey guys, if people are unmuting, please stay muted. Thank you. Tapping into your father line on the right side, the men that you come from. The good, the bad, and the ugly, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, the masculine lineage that poured forth into the body of your father that created your body. Feeling the resourcing from your father line and offering gratitude. And then tapping into your left shoulder, your mother line, the women that you come from, your maternal lineage, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and all of the feminine resourcing and power that you come from, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And giving thanks for the bodies that created the body of your mother, that then created the body of you inside of her. And simply acknowledging that we all are here because at one point in time, a man and a woman came together and they created life together in union. Acknowledging the life force energy that wove us together and that brought us forth as beings of light, as men and women of hope in these times of violence, these times of consciousness, here to do our work. And so for that alone, regardless of how we feel about our parents, we say, thank you for my life. Thank you for the gift of life that you offered to me by coming together. Thank you. All right, we can take some time to slowly reorient back to the screen. And we're going to get into it. So, this class was inspired by a dream that I had a couple of months ago. And it came from a transmission that I received when I woke up from this dream on like a Saturday morning. And the transmission was the men need to come together and pray for the women, and the women need to come together and pray for the men. And all morning, I was just in my head thinking about this. The women need to come together and pray for the men. The men need to come together, pray for the women. What does that mean? What does that mean? And I'm cooking and I'm like, I literally don't know what that means. I have no clue what's going on here. And as I'm just kind of in my process throughout the morning, I realized, okay, I don't know what this means, but it's clearly my responsibility to somehow figure this out because I've been given this transmission. And so shortly after this, pretty much just a few days after I had this dream, I had a crazy amount of men and women in my field asking me to start including men in my work and to teach them and to support them in the way that I have been teaching and supporting women for the past 8 years. And so this class, this co-ed class, my first time teaching a co-ed class, which is really fun, is part one of that answer to the Dreamtime transmission that I was given to steward. So I'm going to get into some potentially controversial territory in this class, and I'm just going to offer a little bit of context about me and my path up front so that you can understand where I'm coming from as I move forward. And to be very clear, everything that I share is my path alone. I don't make assumptions or judgments about anyone else's path, especially those who have walked through similar experiences as I have. It's simply just like what my life has been thus far and what my work is informed by. So I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, with a very liberal upbringing. I went to a performing arts middle school and high school, and I was surrounded by a lot of queer classmates and teachers and community members, and there was just a lot of room for various expressions of gender and sexuality throughout my childhood and adolescence. And then at 18, I moved to New York City, where I was living on and off for about 8.5 years, and I was deeply immersed in the downtown underground world of art and queerness and like very radical self-expression. And during this time, I ended up identifying as non-binary and bisexual and polyamorous for like 7-ish years during my late teens and early 20s. And I went just like all in with the weirdness that is New York City. If anybody has ever lived in New York, you know it's just like a wild place and you just do a lot of wild things. Now, another important thing to offer is that I also have a very significant history of sexual violence that spanned over 2 decades of my life, beginning at age 6 up until like 26. And I was suffering tremendously from many of the common symptoms that sexual abuse survivors experience, such as anxiety, mania, depression, chronic reproductive health issues, UTIs, yeast infections, painful irregular periods. I had ovarian cysts. I had a complete inability to orgasm, and I was also moving through like extreme expressions of hypersexuality. And so living in New York in this wild underground queer artist scene, everyone around me was giving me like all this different advice about how I could heal from my sexual trauma, right? So I had people being like, oh, you have all this sexual trauma. You really need to go learn Tantra. That's going to be so healing from you. And so I went and I tried to do that, and it made it all worse. Then people told me, oh, you have all this sexual trauma. You should go learn about BDSM. That's going to be so healing for you. And so I went, and guess what? Also was not healing, made it worse. Then I had people in like the weird spiritual circles being like, oh, you have all this sexual trauma. You should like be working with sex magic, and it's going to transmute all of that and it'll help you heal. And guess what? It did not help me heal. It actually made things so bad that I was dealing with a severe womb infection called pelvic inflammatory disease that went undiagnosed for 9 months and almost cost me my fertility. So during this time, in like my early mid 20s, I was also traveling back and forth from New York City to the Colombian jungle in South America, where I had been initiated into a ceremonial way of life at the age of 24 with the medicine of yahe, which is the Colombian brew of ayahuasca. And so at 26, when I was finally diagnosed with pelvic inflammatory disease, I made my way back to the jungle and I ended up living and being spiritually adopted by my late and beloved elders. So my spiritual grandfather's name was Abuelo Querhuinqueta Alvarado. He was a world-renowned spiritual and political leader of the Kofan Nation who died at 110. And then my spiritual grandmother's name was Abuela Maria Magdalena Toiquema, and she was a matriarch of the Murui Nation, and she was a very powerful medicine woman and artesana in her own right. So during this time, I spent a year and a half straight living in the jungle full time with my elders, and I was accompanying them through hundreds and hundreds of traditional ceremonies. And during this time, I was healing my physical illnesses, predominantly my reproductive illnesses in my womb, along with all of the spiritual illness that had created so much dis-ease in my body, predominantly from all the sexual abuse that I had experienced, not only in my own lifetime, but like 7 whole generations of a high degree of sexual abuse that had been experienced in my lineage. And so what this looked like on like a real practical level was me drinking hundreds and hundreds of cups of ayahuasca where I was just left like screaming, puking, and crying on the jungle floor as I was purging and cleaning all of that distortion and violence from my bloodline. And little by little, throughout that process, I healed. Now, during the years that I spent in the jungle, I was experiencing a very, 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 very different culture of how men and women relate, which was nothing like what I had grown up with. So it was one where gender roles were very clear cut and specific and tailored to the biological needs and the biological realities of both of the sexes, specifically in relationship to pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and child rearing. And what I was being initiated into during this time was the biological and spiritual framework of intact family culture, which is one that is pretty much entirely absent from our family and community systems in the United States. And so when I think about the jungle and when I think about the current kind of like social media trad wife trend, I can say that I like literally lived with like, I'm saying this in quotes, like traditional wives, right? Like in the jungle. And none of them were embodying this kind of like romanticized, infantilized, fetishized, and monetized, let's be real, monetized version of like social media femininity in relationship to marriage and child rearing, right? That is not what I saw in terms of like intact motherhood, intact womanhood. These were women who were like fierce jungle jaguar warriors who were walking through the territory with babies strapped on their back and like machetes in their hands, okay? And essentially, this was what I was understanding the biological and primal and spiritual design of what pre-domesticated womanhood looks like in relationship to reproductive realities of family creation and male and female relating. And to be clear, these women were still like dancing and singing and weaving and beating and laughing and making art and enjoying life in all of their feminine glory. But they were extremely powerful and fully maturated women who just like did not mess around. Now, the men in the pueblo too were just like straight guerrero warriors, right? Who had not had their primal masculinity stripped away from them yet. And this is because, in all honesty, the territory of the jungle is in the middle of like profound danger and violence, right? We're talking about narco trafficking, we're talking about guerrilla warfare, we're talking about hostile military relations. And so these men in the pueblo had to show up in their most fierce warrior expression in order to keep their families safe, which pretty much means that all of these men knew how to kill and had killed before. And so during this time, what was happening for me is that I was learning how to trust and feel safe around men again, after all of the violence that I experienced at the hands of men for 2 decades of my life. And I was understanding that as a woman, it's my birthright to feel protected by men without having to trade sex for safety. This was a huge reorientation for me to womanhood as I began to understand that within an intact culture, my biological and spiritual capacity to conceive, gestate, birth, and nurture life guaranteed me safety, protection, and provision from the men of my community. And I was understanding that it's a man's highest calling to create safety, for the women in his life so that they may carry the future generations forward with as much ease, peace, and support as possible. And so, in this process, slowly but surely, I was shedding the identities that my younger, very traumatized self had latched onto as this form of armor, right? And for me, what that looked like, again, this is just my story. What that looked like for me was releasing that non binary identity, releasing that bisexual identity, releasing that attachment to polyamory, and getting really clear about how I wanted to relate to my female sexuality in relationship to male sexuality. And so eventually, my time in the jungle came to an end, and I was helping midwifing my elders through their respective deaths. And then I ended up back in the United States, where I was essentially like comparing and contrasting notes about all of the ways in which men and women are relating in our modern culture and how this lack of intact family culture has done severe damage to our intimate partnerships, to our relationships with our parents, our siblings, our children, our friendships, our community support networks, and on an ecological level, our relationship with the land and the waters. And so I entered into this deep study of how male and female relating has, guided me towards what I'm going to be sharing today. Mostly as to how it relates to the reproductive continuum and the creation and maintenance of family systems and community support networks. So this is actually my like undercover reason why I ended up going into birth work, why I ended up going to midwifery school, is that because in all of these situations, while I'm accompanying people through the reproductive continuum in preconception, in pregnancy, in birth, and in postpartum, I get to do just like a bunch of undercover anthropological study of what is actually happening between men and women and parents and elders and children. So, with all of that being said, we're going to look at how we got to where we are right now. And so, my deep knowing, after my time living within an intact culture in the jungle, is that intergenerational family-centered communities are the blueprint of human relating, which begins first and foremost with healthy relating between men and women. What I also know is that intact family culture looks like centering the health and well-being of the most vulnerable members of our communities, which means the children, the elders, and the women, more specifically the pregnant and the postpartum mothers. As such, right, when we look at that orientation of what intact family culture looks like, the right order of healthy relation means women holding responsibility for the creation of the human species by way of pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding, and men holding responsibility for the survival of the human species by way of protection and provision of the women, children, and elders. Now, this order, which is what my spiritual grandfather referred to as la ley de la naturaleza, which means natural law, is also reflected in the way that we relate to the earth, because thriving life within a family system and a community support network is in direct reflection, direct relationship to the health, vitality, and fertility of the land and the waters that we're responsible for guarding, stewarding, and caretaking as humankin. But we are clearly not here currently. And so what happened, right? How did we get from that to what's going on now? And my felt sense, my knowing from the stories that I've heard from various elders and teachers and mentors, along with my own deep study of intergenerational trauma and cosmological warfare, is that at one point in time, many thousands of years ago in human history, there was this infiltration of a death over culture programming that targeted all of our indigenous lifeways, wherever we came from, whatever lands we belonged to, as an attack upon fertility, creation, beauty, and right alignment with the laws of nature. And this attack that came in, this death over culture, specifically targeted the feminine essence that lives within us, both men and women alike, and pulled us away both from our innate gifts and our responsibilities to maintain balanced and loving relationships with our human, animal, plant, elemental, and ancestral kin. The reason that this attack was done upon the feminine nature inside of all of us is because the feminine that we all hold is where all of creation originates from. And then all of that is directed and channeled by an intact, healthy masculine structure that we create in balance with our own internal feminine work. Now, for women, what this quite literally looked like was waves of mass genocides that systematically wiped us out, specifically the genocides of medicine women of our communities, which means the female elders, the midwives and birth workers, the herbalists, the body workers, the community healers and political leaders, and spiritual oracles of family and communal life. And this was happening throughout the centuries-long genocide in Europe, known as the witch trials. And there are also many oral histories that speak to similar mass femicides in other parts of the world during this same time. Along with femicide and genocide, rape, of course, was also often used as a war tactic against our foremothers as well. Now, for what this looked like for the men, is that it looked like them watching their mothers and wives and sisters and daughters and female community members being raped and burned and tortured and drowned and hung in a public forum, being forced to watch and not being able to do anything to save them, which when I look at that, I see that as an attack upon that warrior blueprint inside of all of men. And so the trauma that men are experiencing, the intergenerational trauma of what it means to be in a male body at this point in time, is not being able to fulfill the biological role as a protector of the more physically and sexually vulnerable sex, which translates to shutdown and freeze, and also an extreme overcorrection of protectiveness that shifts into patriarchal domination over women. And so practically what this looks like is essentially men doing everything that they possibly can to keep their women safe by like silencing them and repressing their sexuality and keeping them locked inside the home so that they could look after them and look over them and keep them from experiencing violence outside of the home. And so what we're seeing here is that there is this warrior blueprint that's becoming distorted and weaponized and shifting the men from protectors into predators. And so we're looking at this death over culture, right, that's being expressed in colonization and enslavement and patriarchy, and it's severing the men and women from our own internal feminine. And then capitalism and land exploitation are also on the rise at this time. What that's looking like is being severed from our relationship with the laws of nature, which are the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the seasons, and then placing economic value on work outside of the home. So any kind of domestic labor that was happening inside of the home, cooking, cleaning, weaving, spinning, planting, harvesting, preparing food and medicine, child rearing, birth, postpartum work, and the tending of the sick and the elderly was not being financially compensated or recognized socially as work, right? And this is work that is predominantly done by women. And so what we're seeing is a very slow development over a couple of centuries, first in Europe and then, spread throughout the world by way of colonization, is a slow development of economic disparity between the sexes, where women are having less and less ability to leave abusive or unhappy partnerships due to lack of economic resourcing and power. What we can compare this to with a lot of scholarship from studies around indigenous cultures, intact native cultures here in Turtle Island, is that there were many cultures where the women had the ability to separate from their partners for whatever reason and keep their personal property, maintain their community role, and find other partners without any kind of penalty. And this is because they still had an intact family culture that was supporting them as single mothers. I'm saying that in quotes, single mothers, because within an intact family culture, there's no such thing as a single mother because everyone is responsible and involved in the child rearing. And so at this point, we get to like the early 20th century, and Western women, predominantly white women, had been very deeply cut off from our womb wisdom keeping ways due to that genocide of our community midwives. And so we decided that it would be safer and more advantageous to essentially just deny and cut off and be entirely separated from the biological reality of our female bodies and go and try to do all the things that men were doing, which is where a lot of the distorted aspects of feminism come into play. Now, to be very clear, I come from a long lineage of feminists on my mother's side. I hold a lot of deep, deep reverence and respect for the women who were fighting very hard for social, economic, and relational equality throughout the 20th century. Because in, writing up my notes for this class, I was researching, okay, like when did women get, these basic rights? So it was not until 1965 that all women could vote, regardless of race or class. It wasn't until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act that prohibited discrimination in housing and lending on the basis of sex. But still at this time, banks were like frequently requiring male cosigners. It was not until 1974 that women could get a credit card without a male signer. In 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act required lenders to finally treat women and men equally when applying for mortgages and credit. And it was not until 1988, with the Women's Business Ownership Act, that women gained the right to operate businesses in the United States without a male cosigner, right? So, like, we're just looking at that reality over the past 50-ish years. And so, with all of these new legal rights, we're seeing that women once again had the ability to leave the unpaid workforce at home and enter into the paid workforce alongside men. And so their work was being valued only because it was outside of the home, not in the way that it used to be valued, where domestic labor was seen as just as important as the labor that men were doing outside, but they were getting compensated. And so this offered them significantly more economic freedom. However, it also did a lot of damage to their health, right? The reason for this is because women were trying to push their bodies to operate on this 24-hour cycle that is aligned with the male hormonal cycle, the testosterone levels. And so what this looked like was women pushing themselves to work through their monthly bleed, women pushing themselves to work throughout pregnancy, and then women pushing themselves to return back to work as soon as possible after birth, which I can say as a women's health care practitioner and reproductive care practitioner, all of this is really, really bad for women's health long term. This is one of the big reasons that we're seeing women struggling so much with perimenopause right now because of this push to like be in the workforce outside of the home and to keep up with men in that way when it goes against what our biology is telling us. Now, what was also not great about this is that it started to put men and women into competition with each other for economic resources. But within an intact culture, men and women are not designed to compete against one another ever, because we have entirely different biological strengths that are meant to complement one another. And so when we place men and women in competition with one another, it's distorting a man's understanding that he's actually only meant to compete against other men for resources that he can then offer to the women in his life for protection and provision. That's the divine design. Men are fueled by healthy competition. When men are competing against one another for resources or for any other thing, it actually boosts their testosterone levels. It raises their hormonal status. In contrast, women, when we are in competition, it actually negatively impacts our hormones because being in a chronic state of high stress and high pressure is like deeply depleting to the female system. And so men and women are competing against one another, and it's not good. No one's having fun with it, right? The other shift that we're seeing with this is that women are no longer staying with men out of economic need. And so it's shifting the spiritual contract of marriage and union and relating from one of financial dependency to one of true choice, which is an objectively good thing, right? We don't want to be in these codependent dynamics anymore. However, what happened, of course, because we always go from like one pendulum swing to the other, is that we swung too far in one direction of like a lot of patriarchal dominance to the other direction where women were essentially deciding that they were like, I no longer need men, I no longer want men, even though I want a relationship with a man, I want to marry a man, I want to create a family with a man, but it's leaving very little room for actual intimacy and healthy interdependency to develop inside the union. So we went from like extreme codependency to like extreme, I don't even know what the word would be, like feeling like repelled almost. I don't know. Thinking that like that was the remedy, but the remedy is somewhere in the middle, but we really couldn't find it. And so, what we're looking at the most extreme end of this spectrum, right, is a lot of radical feminism, where we see like aggressive female domination over men. We see a high degree of emasculation. We see like constant criticism of men. And at the most extreme end, right, just like outright hatred towards the men, while also still wanting to be in relationships with men. And so, it's like quite confusing for everyone involved, right? Now, what's also happening during this time, like the 60s to the 90s, is that women were entering into the paid workforce, competing against men for resources, and also moving into like the sexual revolution. We had the introduction of hormonal birth control, we had free love culture, and we had more widespread access to, excuse me, to abortion. Now, to be very clear, I'm trained in abortion care. I support a lot of men and women in the emotional processing of abortions. And so, when I talk about like widespread access to abortion, I'm speaking from a place of like really deeply understanding how much that impacts the body, psyche, and spirit of both men and women alike, while also still supporting the right for women to choose whether or not they're going to continue a pregnancy. I really kind of exist in that gray area, both and of understanding with it. And so, what we're seeing with like free love, more birth control, more access to abortion is that again, we're going from one extreme end of like so much sexual repression, a lot of which was like religious, into another extreme end of so-called sexual freedom, I say in quotes, where sex could be had without the consequences of reproduction getting in the way. And so, what I want to talk about are the consequences of hormonal contraceptives upon union, right? First things first is that hormonal contraceptives stop women from ovulating. When we are on contraceptives, we're not ovulating. It's disconnecting us from our libido and our sense of sexual attraction. And so that's shifting our hormonal status to being higher in testosterone, which means that we're perceiving the world from the right side of our brain, which is where testosterone is produced, instead of the left side of our brain where estrogen is produced. And so what this does is this masculinized women. And it impacted the men that we were attracted to because our pheromone receptors were being altered. And so when you have the women becoming hormonally more and more masculine, it's going to have an impact on the men, especially in terms of like a lot of the emasculation culture that was happening and the criticism that literally depletes a man's testosterone level. So we have women being masculized and men being deeply feminized on like a literal hormonal level when you look at our levels right now. What's also happening with hormonal contraceptives is that women cannot actually connect to our sexuality, right? And so the men that we're having sex with when we're on hormonal contraceptives don't actually know whether there's true biological attraction and also genetic compatibility. Our pheromone receptors are what tell us that man would be someone that I would have genetically compatible children with. That's not happening when we're on contraceptives. And so when women are not connected to our libido, the sex is going to be significantly worse for everyone involved because the male libido is existing in relationship to the female libido. The male libido is taking data and information that it's receiving from onyx expressions of female desire, and it's being channeled in the direction of erotic safety and pleasure. That is the divine design of what sexual intimacy between men and women looks like when women are not disconnected from our libido. It's the men channeling the erotic life force energy of the female libido, which is the creation, the origin of all of creation on earth. And so, my hot take as someone who was on hormonal contraceptives for 5 years is that when they were introduced into my life and into just the collective consciousness, we started having significantly bad sex, like honestly, because the polarity between all of us is dampened and the erotic charge is nullified. And I've spoken to so many women about this, and it is like the constant theme of like, I had no libido until I got off of contraceptives. And then I realized what my sexual desire actually was. And it drastically changed my relationship with my partner for better or for worse. Now, with hormonal contraceptives, we also have the free love movement, right? Which essentially looked like a bunch of hippies having a lot of random sex with people, right? That they had not developed any true safety and commitment and care and respect with, which creates a lot of physical and emotional damage for both men and women alike. And I can speak from like genuine experience, not as like judgment, but like I know what that feels like in the body, right? What's also happening during this time is that there's a lot of mixing of drugs and sex and alcohol and altered states of consciousness, which is crazy because sex is already a very extreme altered state of consciousness. And it's very damaging because there's a lot of blurry experiences of kind of gray area non-consent that's happening. And so what we're seeing during this time is many women's worst nightmares coming to fruition, which is the worst nightmare of being raped. And then many of men's worst nightmares coming to fruition, which is the fear of being accused of being a rapist, right? This is more common when substances are involved. The other thing about free love is that casual sex, when that's being had, it's a woman opening her legs to a man, but not opening her heart at all because she doesn't know him. There's no way she could open her heart to him, right? Which means that a woman is not actually surrendering in any way to the man in any capacity, and she's still holding all of the control in the sexual dynamic, which is very, very confusing for everyone involved, especially the man, because what this means is that he's penetrating her, but he's not actually able to exercise his full erotic power because this woman is not actually open to him in any way. And so it's like fuzzying the signal, right? This man is like, this woman is totally open to me, but I'm feeling that she's totally not. And so we're confusing each other in these casual sex dynamics, and it's messing with our ability to be able to define what true consent and desire actually looks like and feels like in our bodies and in the bodies of our partners. What's also happening during this is sex is being separated from the reality of reproduction, right? Because we have birth control and we have a lot more access to abortion. And so people are not really questioning whether they would want to get pregnant and start a family with the people that they're having sex with because they're on contraceptives. And so because of that, the standards of who has access to our body and our sexuality, again, starts getting very blurry and slippery for both men and women because we're not having to consider the reality of a baby, right? We're not having to step into that very mature expression of adult sexuality, which is if I had a baby, if I had sex and got pregnant with this person, would I really want to create a family with them? Do I feel ready for that? Do they feel ready for that? Is this the person that I want to mix my bloodline with, right? Like that question was kind of thrown out the window with contraceptives. So next, we see a rise in internet pornography in the 90s. And so, oh, someone said, I'm 73 and you figured out a lot of this very early. You're a gift to your generation. Thank you, Stella. I appreciate that. I'm happy this is making sense. All right, the 90s, pornography. Let's get into it. This is pretty much where every single one of us received our sexual education, right? Because we no longer had any traditional community midwives who were responsible for the sexual education and to offer us a bio-spiritual orientation that addresses both the physical and the emotional aspects of sexual union without shame, without dogma, without repression, and without fear. Now, what internet porn did is that it brought the underground world of the sex industry into our homes by way of our screens. And so what I know for myself and what I know for pretty much everyone that I've ever met is that most of us are exposed to pornography non-consensually in our very early formative years. And it's often through like other children, maybe like older siblings or cousins or like kids at school, or it's like finding pornographic material that our parents or other people in the home are consuming. And so I want to break down what internet pornography does to us, our small child brains and our adolescent brains when we're first exposed to it. What happens is that it hijacks the mesolimbic reward system, which is triggering massive dopamine releases, and it exceeds the dopamine releases that would be experienced during natural sexual activity. And so over time, what's happening is that our brain is decreasing the amount of dopamine receptors in order to handle this overstimulation, which leads to tolerance, where viewers need to watch more and more extreme and more frequent content to achieve the same amount of pleasure. What's also happening in the brain is that it's reducing the gray matter in our prefrontal cortex here, which, to be clear, our prefrontal cortex does not stop developing until like someone recently told me 30. I was like, that's crazy. I always thought it was 25. Okay, so our prefrontal cortex is like incredibly vulnerable in our childhoods, and this is responsible for impulse control, decision making, and motivation. And so, what we're seeing with pornography, early exposure, what it's doing in our very young brains is creating addiction like symptoms, which is reduced motivation, increased anxiety, and desensitization to real life sexual intimacy. Now, the other reality of porn that we are being exposed to as young children is that it is not a loving, committed, kind, respectful, embodied depiction of adult sexuality. It is a branch of the sex industry that profits off of the ongoing re-victimization of sexual abuse survivors, usually child sexual abuse survivors. And the people who are involved in the porn industry and the sex industry at large are performing sexual acts for money, oftentimes for survival means. And so even people who are entering into the sex industry consensually, right, I'm saying this in quotes, are often trafficking survivors who are getting pulled back into the sex industry, or individuals who have been sexually abused in childhood, the teen years, or early adulthoods. And I say all of this because I work with a lot of women who have been trafficked, who have been involved in the sex industry. And so this comes from many, many years of being deep in relationship with them and learning their stories and understanding how all of this operates, right? So, all of this is to say, our very young brains in childhood and early adolescence are being programmed through pornography to connect our libido, our eroticism, and our arousal with graphic and highly addictive re-victimization scenes of child rape survivors, which I know is a very strong thing for me to have just said, right? But it is literally what the market of the sex industry is based upon. And so I name this with clarity. I name this like strategically and specifically because part of my spiritual contract with my elders is to speak truth into distortion and to breathe light into darkness. And this, what we're talking about, is one of the darkest aspects of modern relating that we're all grappling with right now. Many of us very unconsciously. What's also happening with pornography is that it's transforming and removing the relational aspect of sex, right? All of the trust and mutual respect and love that is required to be built first so that safe and loving sexual union can be experienced. It's also doing something very similar to the free love movement, which is that it's removing the reproductive aspect of sex, the biological understanding that the end result of sexual union between a man and a woman is often the creation of a life, aka a baby, which is requiring a high degree of discernment, clarity, maturity, and responsibility. And so, what this means is that we now have men and women who are being infiltrated with rape culture programming and sexual energetics that are devoid of any adult responsibility and true relationality, intimacy, closeness. We're disconnected from our libidos. We're trying to relate to one another as we're coming into like our teen years and our early adulthood, where our hormones are like raging and our bodies are telling us to explore and experiment and express our desire, all of which is natural and normal and beautiful and not a problem at all. And is also the phase of our development, like 13 to 25, that is being targeted by this death over culture, whose goal is to siphon this life force energy directly from our fertility, our health, and our vitality. So I want to be really, really clear when I say literally none of this is like our individual faults, especially when I'm speaking about pornography. I want to really like unshame all of this and bring it up to the light because it impacts every single one of us in very different ways. It is not our fault that the vast majority of our sexual education has come from the warped and distorted source of pornography, right? Some of us grew up in like extremely religious households where sexuality was demonized. Some of us grew up with parents who were deeply uncomfortable with sex and or had like their own unresolved sexual trauma that prohibited them from being able to talk openly about it with us, to speak about it appropriately, right? Some of us had like that weird sexual education from the Mean Girls movie, right? That scene where the gym teacher is just like, don't have sex because you'll get pregnant and die, and then like throws condoms at the kids. Like that's often what is happening in the school system. It's like ridiculous, right? Like that's our sexual education. No shit. Like we're so messed up right now. That's what we were resourced with, right? And so all of that is to say, porn is often the most easily accessible thing for young and curious and hormonal children and teenagers. And it's also very addictive, especially for the young developing brain, especially for young boys, because for men, sex is more of a visual experience versus for women, it's actually more auditory. That's based on the brain relays and all of the reproductive organs where they are connecting into in the brain. For men, it's more visual. For women, it's more auditory. And so it's really attacking more than anything the male libido and the libido of young boys, right? So all of that is to say, we're living in this like unconscious culture of pornified relations, right? We're disconnected from the sensitivity of our bodies, our psyches, our spirits, and we have no clue how to come back together with loving and open hearts. That is what we speak to when we're looking at this death over culture. That's what it's doing to our bodies and our relationships. Now, when I'm looking at all of this, as, a student midwife, as a women's reproductive care practitioner, what I'm thinking first and foremost is like, okay, how is this impacting our health? More specifically, our reproductive health as both men and women. And so the impacts of hormonal birth control and non-committal sex, men and women competing against one another, all of these extreme swings from like power and domination and yeah, just turning against one another. And then also pornography and the infiltration of like hypersexuality in media, the underworld of the sex industry and all of its tendrils into our unions. Like, what is going on here with our health? And so, hormonally, we have to understand that our hormonal health is literally everything in the body. The hormones are the body's chemical messengers, right? They control nearly every single process required for survival. So, it regulates metabolism, our stress response, our sleep cycles, our mood, and our reproductive functions. It acts as a master control system, which governs the growth, body weight, and heart rate. And it also ensures the body's stable internal balance. And the hormones are communicating and coordinating between all of our organs and all of our tissues. And so they're impacting every single major system in the body. Now, when we talk about this death over culture and the targeting of our hormones and reproductive systems, it's an attack upon our creative and generative capacity as human beings. Because every single thing that is birthed into reality on Earth originates from the life force energy that is our libido, that is our sexual health. So what this looks like for women is that we're struggling severely with our hormonal health. And like I work with women all day, every day. I'm seeing women in prenatals and in births and in postpartums and in well woman visits and doing one-on-ones. And I'm teaching women all of the time. And what I'm seeing is that we're exhausted. We are depleted. We are struggling with painful menstrual cycles and ovarian cysts and fibroids and endometriosis, thyroid disorders, low sex drive, infertility. And many of the women who are like even into their late 30s and their 40s, seeing huge challenges with perimenopause because women have been forced to ignore the needs of our menstrual cycles, pregnancies, and postpartum periods, and we're running on empty gas tanks. Now, for men, what is looking like with their health is that this is crazy. This is like literally insane to me. Men are currently struggling with the lowest recorded rates of testosterone in history. That's crazy, okay? What this means is that men are struggling with severe depression because when men have low testosterone, they get depressed. Men are struggling with lack of motivation. They're struggling with low sex drive. They're struggling with erectile dysfunction. They're struggling with damaged sperm quality, which there are recent studies that have come out that show that damaged sperm quality actually contributes to repeated miscarriages and fertility issues. They're struggling with irritability. They're struggling with hair loss. And most importantly, for a man, low testosterone means lack of purpose. Purpose is like everything for a man, having a clear vision, a clear North Star. What am I working towards? What am I serving? What am I devoting my life force energy to? Low testosterone hijacks the ability for men to be in clear alignment with that, which is like devastating for a man. And so, what we're seeing with this severe hormonal health issues is that both men and women are requiring a lot of expensive medical intervention, right? This looks like expensive fertility treatments. This also looks like a lot of dependency creating hormonal replacement therapy treatments. For men, they're getting a bunch of testosterone injected. For women, they're getting estrogen injected, which my personal opinion, again, as you know, a student midwife who's studying this all the time in the world of fertility and birth and preconception, is that I don't think it would be necessary for us to get any kind of hormonal replacement therapy if we were properly educated on the ways to care for our reproductive and hormonal health, starting at puberty, right? Starting at like 13. Women's fertility in particular is being highly medicated and highly controlled by the medical industrial complex and fertility industry, which is like the pipeline that I see. It's birth control starting at puberty. Then it's IVF when we're coming into our mothering years. Then it's going to be a lot of antidepressants when we're in postpartum and we're entirely unsupported and we're losing our minds, which is a normal and healthy expression of lack of a village. And then we're being put on HRT throughout perimenopause. And all of this is taking a huge toll on women's bodies, psyches, and spirits. And it's also drastically impacting how we are interacting with the men in our life, specifically our male partners. When our hormonal matrix is whack, it is going to immediately be projected onto our men because they're the closest to us, right? They're getting the backlash of all of our hormonal dis-ease. What this also means is that we're just looking at a culture that is highly medicated. And my personal opinion is that being extremely anxious and extremely depressed in this effed up culture that we live in is also a normal and healthy response to the fact that we don't live in a true, fertile, vibrant, healthy, supported culture, right? It would be crazy if some of us didn't go through insane periods of depression. What we're moving through is truly insane, right? And it's being deeply impacted by the depletion of our hormonal health, which is going to be impacting our mental health, what people would refer to as mental health, what's going on in the brain, because the brain is relaying all of the information from our reproductive system by way of our hormonal messengers 24/7. And so when that's effed up, everything's effed up, right? All of which is to say, none of this is contributing to thriving erotic lives, creative lives, professional lives, or communal lives because we're all drained of our life force energy. Now, socially and relationally, what we're seeing these days is also another big pendulum swing, right? So we went from patriarchy, which is male domination over women, which again was not good for men or women, into radical feminism, which was female domination over men, which also was not good for either men or women. And we're seeing this big desire to return to more traditional biological roles. And the most extreme end of the spectrum that we're seeing is like the big trad wife trend and then the like red pill manosphere movement, which when I feel into, and I've done a lot of weird research around all of this, you guys, like I've been studying this, and when I feel into it, it's like almost there, but like so missing the mark. And what's happening is that women are like super burnt out and we're exhausted and we're pushing against the biological reality of our wombs. And we just want to be in our soft girl era. We're like, I want a man to just fully provide for me and I never want to have to do anything hard ever again. Thank you. I'm good. And what this means is that we're not actually having to cultivate a healthy internal masculine, right? We've been doing like a very toxic masculine expression in our bodies, and we don't have to cultivate the healthy part that would hold us and contain us and keep us safe and protected and internally resourced. What we're seeing with men is that they are tired of being chronically emasculated and unneeded and rejected by women. And they want to step into their innate power and strength, and they want to feel respected more than anything. But in this like weird manosphere world, they're not cultivating any kind of emotional intelligence or emotional vulnerability or availability, right? Which means that they are not cultivating their own internal feminine, their own softness, their own tenderness, their own relationality, right? They're trying to escape that homework while women are trying to escape our homework. And so what I see is that like we're trying to return to this like 1950s vibe that like doesn't actually meet the needs of what 2026 is asking from us. Now, to be super clear, I very much support biological coherence in relationships, right? We know that the mother-baby dyad is the most sacred bond that exists. We know that a mother's nervous system is quite literally interlinked with her child's nervous system. We know that secure attachment bonds are first created between mothers and babies, and they set the stage for every single relationship that will happen thereafter. We know the importance of breastfeeding and co-sleeping and co-regulation between a mother and a child. And so I speak, as a student midwife, as a protector of the mother-baby dyad, and as a supporter of intact fatherhood that protects and provides for the safety of the mother-baby dyad. I am all for women not having to work if they don't want to, especially when their kids are young. And I think that orientation just comes from the fact that I know that mothers are working literally like 24/7 to just keep children alive. Like they're working. They don't need to work anymore. If they want to, sure, but like the pressure to be put on mothers is like insane, right? And so what we're also seeing is a big shift that a lot of women are stepping into, which is this desire to share our medicine with the world, to make money, to birth business, to have projects, art projects, community liberation movements, right? We're also seeing a desire for men to be more intimately involved with the development of their children. So we're seeing fathers who genuinely want to be there, right? They want to show up as much as possible for the development of their children. We're seeing fathers who genuinely want to be around their children and present. They want to be available. They want to be fully spiritually online and not just focused on providing 24/7. And so what we see is that the spiritual contract of union and marriage and family and community co-creation is essentially asking for women to develop strong spines without losing our feminine softness, and for men to soften and open their hearts without losing their masculine power, strength, and stability. What we're also seeing in all of our relationships is a collective desire to break the spell of codependency, right? With our romantic partners, but also with our friends, with our parents, with our siblings, with our business collaborators, with our clients. We're all like, no more codependency. It makes us sick. And so we're coming into contracts of relating and union creation that is based upon the shared understanding that each party has the right to walk away at any time if it is the most loving thing to do. And so we're being asked to cultivate solid internal union of both our masculine and feminine that can resource us appropriately and feed our external unions in a loving and respectful way. Now, what's also happening, most specifically for parents and for families, is that we no longer have access to intergenerational family systems or extended community support networks, right? And so we're left to figure out how we're going to rebirth this village of intact family culture without any clear tools or instructions on how to do that, especially with members of the opposite sex, which means that in partnership specifically and in parenting specifically, men and women are, for no fault of their own, to be clear, asking way too much from one another because we don't have healthy male and female support networks that support us separately. Men need time with other men. Women need time with other women. We really, really, really need time with other people of the same sex to tend to the biological needs that fuel us. So what that looks like for men is being able to be physically active and in healthy competition with other men, which is going to the gym together, playing sports, working on the land, utilizing their hands, physical strength, all of which is raising testosterone levels. Men need space to channel their aggression and their physicality so that it doesn't come out in angry outbursts around women. For women, it looks like having a lot of in-depth, emotionally intimate conversations with other women, which is tending and befriending and releasing all of this oxytocin that's shifting us out of fight or flight. Processing, verbal processing, is extremely important for us as women. But too much of it, when we're having it with men, actually depletes their testosterone levels. And so when he's the only emotional support system in our lives, it's bad for him. Like it's bad for his health. That's like literally his hormonal health is bad for him. We need a lot of girlfriends to be able to do that with because for men, they get to a certain point where they're like, I'm tapped out. They like shut down. They can't do it. It's not because anything is wrong with him. It's because biologically he's not designed for it. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we have the like spiritual woo-woo world, right? We have like the light washing, like sacred polarity vibes, and it's all just like bypassing biological relating between men and women, right? So, one example is like this whole thing of like the feminine is supposed to be open and receptive, and if she isn't, then she's in her masculine, right? Which in reality, if you know anything about the female genitalia, right, like actual anatomy, the vagina, the vulva, and the cervix are not available for any form of penetration unless serious safety is developed first. And so our pelvic floor will literally remain closed and numb and unreceptive because it would go against the law of our body to force it to be open when no safety has been created. Another example is this like stupid thing that people say that like the masculine is always supposed to just penetrate and like lead. And if a man is not pursuing all the time, then he's in his feminine, right? When in reality, a mature man would never try to like penetrate into any space until he's been explicitly welcomed. And he's waiting for the woman to express both interest and consent for him to be able to move forward and penetrate energetically or otherwise. Because anatomically speaking, if we think about a man just walking around with an erect penis all the time, like ready to penetrate, that would be dangerous. What if he walks into like a bear trap? That's crazy, right? Like, that's not how the male system operates. A healthy masculine operates upon invitation, like true invitation and receptivity to what the female desire is offering. And so, all that is to say that, like, spiritual teachings on how men and women are supposed to relate really are not grounded in material biological reality. Okay. And so, what's going on? What are we doing? Because we're really not learning that much about our bodies. Therefore, we're really not learning that much about the bodies of other people. We're not learning how to relate very well. So, what do we do? And what I feel into is this understanding of what existed in all of our family systems and all of our cultures at one point in time, which is a rebirth of spiritually intact sexual education, which essentially requires us to time travel back to the ages of like 13 and 25 and reinitiate ourselves into mature adult sexuality during the ages that we would be transitioning from children into young adults. Now, the reason I use age 13 to 25 is because from a reproductive standpoint, puberty is when our libidos are coming online and beginning to come into full force at like 13. And then sexual maturity is solidified around 25. So for women, our eggs begin to release at our first period on average at 13, and they're done developing at 25. For men, your prostate is doubling in size during puberty, and then it begins to grow again at age 25. So for both men and women, 13 to 25 is like when we really need tending. And so the sexual education that we all deserved to receive between 13 and 25 is not purity culture based. That's like religious dogma and shame and repression and abstinence only education. And it's also not like sex positivity hookup culture that is based solely on physical pleasure and sexual exploration at the expense of emotional safety, right? What we're looking at is like a secret third thing that all of our lineages tended to at some point in time before it was colonized out of us, which pairs biological truth and psycho-spiritual orientation. And so what this looks like is a deep study of first, in-depth body literacy that explains the inherent biological differences between men and women, right? So understanding embryology and reproductive development, understanding endocrinology and hormonal health, understanding nervous system responses, understanding male and female behavioral patterns, and essentially in this deep reverence to how does your body actually work? How do male and female systems differ? What are your patterns rooted in biologically? The second thing that we would be learning would be all of the psycho-spiritual integration of what our relationships are asking of us, our romantic partnerships, our family dynamics, our friendships, our community networks, and our ecological responsibility as stewards of this earth. And so all of that part of biospiritual sexual education would be clarifying the spiritual contract of why are we coming together as co-creators in any kind of relationship, romantic or otherwise. What are we birthing together? Not just having a baby with someone, but the co-weaving of a shared dream and vision and prayer and shared orientation to thriving life. And so my personal opinion with all of this is that when we tend to our relationships, we're tending to the awakening of human consciousness, the reorientation towards fertility, health, and vitality, and the cultivation of our most loving and fruitful selves. This is what spiritually intact sexual education would actually entail. And so, why does this matter, right? Like, why is this so important that we tend to this now with the current state of how men and women are relating? And what I know to be true and what I feel, the reason this matters is because so many different elders from around the world have shared that the reason that the last world ended is because men and women forgot how to need each other. Not like needing out of codependency, but needing from a place of sovereign choice and respect and autonomy and true witnessing of one another's gifts and blessings and offerings. It matters for those of us who are single and want to develop, a loving future partnership and future family. It matters for those of us who are already in relationships and want to maintain strong, respectful, and passionate unions. It matters for parents and for hopeful future parents that want to better understand their child's reproductive development and orient them towards loving future relationships so that these messed up ancestral patterns of dysfunction no longer continue in our lineages. It matters for those of us who want to create and co-create more cohesive support networks that tend to the most vulnerable members of our communities. It matters for anyone who cares about the land, the waters, because the way that we relate to our human kin is directly reflected in the way that we relate to our ecological kin. And it matters for those of us, the men and women of hope, who are coming together in prayer to take action in these times of violence and times of consciousness, right? We can sit here and pray and do all that we want, but my elders always oriented me towards pray, act. Pray, act. Receive the vision, bring it forth. That is what this work is. And so, in response to that original Dreamtime transmission that I shared at the very beginning, right? The men need to come together and pray for the women need to come together and pray for the men. I've been in a deep process of developing an adult sexual education class with a dear friend and collaborator, Alani Engelkin, who is here, that will begin this work of rebirthing spiritually intact sexual education in our partnerships, our families, in our communities. And so what this is going to be is an 8-week class. It's called The Biology of Love. I love the title. And it's going to cover the biological and spiritual aspects of what male and female relationship dynamics are designed to be and experienced as within an intact culture in both our romantic and platonic contexts. All of these classes are going to be recorded. They'll be accessible in both video and audio form. You can listen whenever you have the time to tune in. I know that many of us have very busy lives, so you can listen in the car, the grocery store, the gym, when you're cleaning up after, in the kitchen after bedtime, all of that good stuff. It'll be available for you whenever it works. We're also going to have 3 mentorship calls that are going to be led by Alani that focus on the practical questions of how do we tend to our relationships. So Alani is a licensed marriage and family therapist with many, many years and experience of tending to relational dynamics, and she'll be available for the personal inquiries that arise. So to be super clear, this is not a dating class. This is not a how to get a partner program. This is not a place to blame men or women. It's not overly clinical or disconnected from real life. And it's also not overly spiritual and disconnected from the body. It's not exclusive to people who are in heterosexual relationship dynamics, because learning how to relate with the opposite sex is deeply vital and important for those of us who want to have better relationships with our parents, our siblings, our friends, our coworkers, collaborators, and the community members that we're in relationship with. So classes are going to start on Tuesday, June 2nd, It is going to be $397 for the full 8 weeks. If you join before this upcoming Saturday, May 23rd at midnight Mountain Standard Time, you'll receive a $50 early bird discount along with access to a really great bonus class that I'm going to be teaching that is all about the man's role in preconception, pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, which is an additional $33 value. You'll receive that with early bird. There's also a payment plan option that will make this class as financially accessible as possible. And I'm also offering a special community rate for any of the single mothers who would like to participate in that. So, with all of that being said, I have spoken enough. I'm going to pass it over to Alani over in Denver, and she is going to share a little bit as well. Alani, where are you? Let's see. There you
I
go.
am here. I can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I have you on a TV at our little cute watch party. I'm gonna try to look here. Hi everyone. Thank you all for so much for being here. Clara, thank you so much for all of the work that you put into this. I'm looking at you over here. Um, I so appreciate the background and it is so helpful. And obviously I am extremely passionate about what you're doing because I work with couples and families and individuals every day who are the children of parents and couples and families. And so, to really change the trajectory of our collective, like we have to be working on a relational and communal level. So, thank you for what you're bringing forth. And I will be so happy to join any of you that want to join us. All right, I'm going to put myself on mute, but I'll be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, friends, I, as I said, talked a lot. I threw so much information at you. Any questions about anything, anything that I brought up, anything about this class that I'll be teaching, anything that you like disagree with and you were like, I don't get it. That doesn't work for me. Open to it. If people want to like either come off of mute or write in the chat, you are welcome to.
I got a question.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on marijuana and how has that been seen from your elders and things that you've learned?
Ooh, that's a fun question. Is it Derek?
Mhm.
That's a really fun question. Okay. So, my personal take on marijuana, it is a beautiful plant. I highly abused it when I was younger and no longer work with it like internally in any way, but it's really amazing topically, especially for women to use on our wombs when we're having a lot of pain. I think that there are ways that it can absolutely be worked with beautifully. However, the way in which it has been quite bastardized by like the marijuana industry is like, in my personal opinion, pretty disrespectful to the spirit of the plant itself. That's like my first thing that I can say. The fun thing, I'll share a story from something that happened to the father of my goddaughter in the jungle. So he was living with my spiritual grandfather, my abuelo, and he went out to the river with a group of guys and he was smoking just tobacco. And someone handed him a spliff, right? Like tobacco and marijuana. And he very haphazardly just like took a puff and was like, oh, cool, whatever, like one or two puffs. And then he left the river and he went back to my abuelo's house. And when he arrived, my abuelo was like, hey, come here. And he's like, what's up? And he goes, sit down. And he goes, what? And he hands him this plant medicine called mambe, which is the coca leaf, and it's a sharing medicine, a talking medicine. And he said to him, take some mambe. We're having a talk. And the father of my goddaughter was like, no, I'm okay. I don't really want some. And my abuelo was like, take the mambe. I have something to say to you. And so they take the mambe. And my abuelo looked at him and he goes, marijuana is a jealous lover. And he was like, what do you mean? And he looked at him and he said, you smoke marijuana. I can feel the spirit in you. And the father of my goddaughter was like, no, I didn't. And he was like, yes, you did. I can feel it. And he was like, oh my God, you're right. I did at the river. I totally forgot. And he said, the way that you are interacting with marijuana, just taking it and like smoking it, not thinking anything of it, passing it on, is how you interact with women, how you're interacting with the feminine spirit. You're abusing it and using it very casually without any kind of reverence or respect for this plant and the feminine nature that it carries. And so, that, if you don't clean that up now, is always going to impact how you operate with women. And it was maybe a couple weeks after that that the father of my goddaughter ended up meeting his wife, the mother of my goddaughter, because he really cleaned up his relationship with marijuana. And so, what I could say about that is that when we're coming into relationship with marijuana, it has to be one of like not a jealous lover. Like my abuelo said, like if you continue to treat her that way, she's going to mess up your wife or your life in the way that a jealous lover comes in and totally F's up your stuff, right? Because you're not respecting her. And if you keep doing that, you're going to keep attracting women that bring that into your life. So that's what I'll say about what my elders taught me. What Western science shows us is that when men smoke marijuana, it damages their sperm quality. It can be one of the things, both marijuana and tobacco, it can be one of the things that actually makes male sperm more likely to cause recurrent miscarriages in women. That's been proven in studies. So that's my take on marijuana. I have a lot of respect for that plant, to be very clear. I think it's a beautiful plant, and I think the way that we abuse it, in the way that we abuse most substances, just needs to come back into right orientation. That's my take. Fun question. All right, what else? Any reflections, any thoughts, questions? Quiet group tonight. Cool. Also fine.
I'll ask. Hi, how
Hi.
are you?
I'm good. Where are you? Who is this speaking? Oh, Emily. Hi, Emily.
This is Emily. Hi.
Hey.
Oh, this is amazing. Thank you. I've learned so much and reflected on so much, Jonah. Um, but yeah, I was really curious as you were talking about all the different ways that different like remedies to problems, like very superficial remedies to problems, came up, or like, one intervention caused another need for intervention. So all these interventions were invented. And yeah, it made me reflect on like my mom's hysterectomy and just the prevalence of like the female reproductive surgeries after birth, and um, how that impacts the ability to like repair the relationship internally, externally. Um, so yeah, I'm just curious to hear about that.
Yeah, definitely. I can speak on that. So, what I can say is that I know women and am in relationship with women who have had hysterectomies. And one story that I can share was a woman who both her and her sister got hysterectomies at around the same time. And both of them, their symptoms kind of went away with the hysterectomy, and then it came back. It was like the same experiences that they were having. And the reason for that, that I can say on a spiritual level, is that I believe that womb consciousness is unbelievably powerful. And so women who are getting hysterectomies, women who, have already gone through menopause and no longer are in their reproductive years, are still tapped into the collective womb consciousness of what that organ holds, because that organ is truly like the it's the matrix. Like in Spanish, the womb is referred to as la matriz, which means like the matrix, like the origin of life, right? And so it's an organ, but it is also a very powerful spiritual technology that exists. And so when this woman was still getting pain even after her hysterectomy, she realized like my womb is still speaking to me even though it's not inside of my body, right? The imprint of womb consciousness is still working through me. And so she did a lot of very, very deep spiritual work around healing her relationship to womanhood, and her symptoms went away, her pain went away. Her sister did not do that same work. her symptoms were still the same as they were before the hysterectomy, and she required multiple more hysterectomies after the fact. And so I'm personally of the opinion that like it's very rare that I think that we need to completely remove any organs from the body, especially the womb. I think that there's so much tending that can be done through many different modalities of just coming back into right alignment with our bodies and understanding the intelligence and what they offer to us. And so I hold a lot of grief and a lot of pain for multiple generations of women who have gone through hysterectomies and who have not been offered other tools and other education and other modalities that could support their reproductive health. Yeah, thank you. Beautiful question. Awesome. Any other questions with things? Cool. Sounds like we're all good. I will be sending out the class replay to all of you guys. I will drop the link in the chat for the class that I will be teaching with Alani, the biology of love. If you want to join before this Saturday, May 23rd, before midnight Mountain Standard Time, you can use that code earlybird, all caps, for a $50 discount. I would really, really love to see any of you there. As I said, there are payment plans to make it as financially accessible as possible, especially for the parents, especially for the single mothers. Please reach out to me if you're a single mother and you would like to join the class. I will offer you a special community discount. Thank you all so much for being here. This was such a gift and a joy and a pleasure. I hope you have a really wonderful rest of your Wednesday, rest of your week, and hopefully I will see you all this summer for the biology of love. Thank you so much.